Hello, everyone. It is the sixth week of the fall 2018 semester for British literature. So we're finished with the Romantic era now. We took the exam on that last week. Now, as of the moment that I'm making this video, only 2 students so far have taken that exam. So I'm hoping that by the time you're seeing this, you also have taken that exam. It was comprehensive, started with the Wordsworth and Coleridge week and went all the way up until last week when we did the late Romantics with Shelley and Lord Byron. So this week we start a whole new chapter, or a whole new section. So we're changing books. So now you can put away that book that we've been using all semester. This is the Victorian era book. Now, if you're using the 9th edition, it's going to look a little different from this on the cover. Instead of having the Lady of Shalott, which, by the way, is one of this week's readings, it'll have a painting by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. But nevertheless, whichever one you choose, you'll find the poems that you need to do in both of them. Now, I've decided to open up the Victorian era with a heavyweight in the Victorian poetry. I would not be doing my job if I taught Victorian era literature and left Lord Tennyson out. Alfred Lord Tennyson was the most important poet of the Victorian era. In fact, he wrote for like 50 years, and on top of that, he was the Poet Laureate of England for many of those years. And the Poet Laureate was a very, very prestigious title that was given to the most important poet of the era. Now, you got to remember, there was a time when poetry was much more important than it is today, because poetry was the form of literary entertainment. This is back before there were televisions and back before there were movies and things like that. So, here's what I want you to look at on the 2 that I selected from Alfred Lord Tennyson. Most people that have ever read Alfred Lord Tennyson know him for Charge of the Light Brigade. I've decided not to make you read that one, but I would suggest, if you like Tennyson, to read Charge of the Light Brigade. Instead, what I've had you read are 2 poems where Alfred Lord Tennyson has a different take on already established stories. We see this a lot these days with things like fan fiction. It's not unusual for people to do parodies of well-known stories. It's not unusual for people to maybe write about a minor character in a major story that was not focused on in the actual original stories. These are things that go on today. These are things that have gone on since forever. So, in Lady of Shalott, it's a new take on the King Arthur legend. Now, there are 2 questions I've asked you about that. One is, how does this address the King Arthur legend? The other, and this is more important, is how is the Lady of Shalott a metaphor for a woman's loss of innocence? As women get older, they turn from little girls into young ladies, and they start to notice boys. And there are all kinds of headaches that are caused for fathers of daughters that once those girls start noticing boys. And that's kind of what happens to Lady Shalott here. She's isolated. She's in a separate room in a castle. She's weaving a tapestry. And tapestries, by the way, were these huge like cloth curtain looking things that were woven, and they often told stories. And so the Lady of Shalott is weaving on this, and she can only see the outside world by looking in a mirror, which shows her the reflection of what's going on outside. She's told if she were to look out the window itself that she would die. So she doesn't look until all of a sudden Lancelot gets, Sir Lancelot, the very handsome knight of King Arthur legend, gets her attention, and then she decides not only to look out the window, in which the mirror shatters, and you can use that as a metaphor for whatever else you want shattering. That mirror shatters, and so she decides to wander outside the castle, where she floats down a river, and I won't tell you what happens next. I'm going to make you read the poem. But you can write about either how it's a new take on the King Arthur legend, focusing on a character that's kind of minor throughout most of King Arthur history, or you can look at how this is a metaphor for a young girl's maturity. You know, how she loses her innocence and becomes a woman, if you will. So you can look at Lady of Shalott like that. The other poem I had you read is a new take on the Odyssey. The title of the poem is Ulysses. Ulysses being the so-called hero of the Odyssey, although I would argue he's not much of a hero when everybody on his ship except for him dies. But, you know, we're going to ignore that. We're just going to look at the fact that Odysseus does, after a 20-year journey and fighting monsters and, you know, being kidnapped by Circe on her island and overcoming all of these obstacles, does eventually get back home to his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. Now, here's the problem. When Odysseus, after spending 10 years in Troy fighting the Trojans, and then 20 years on this journey back, a journey which took most people in Greece, you know, a couple of months to get back. It took him 20 years to get back. He comes home to a wife that's no longer as young and beautiful as she used to be. He comes home to a son that is no longer a little boy, but is actually a man. He also comes home to find that a lot of suitors for Penelope have destroyed his land and eaten up a lot of his crops and stuff, trying to get her to write Ulysses off and to marry them. So Ulysses gets home. He's the king of Ithaca. He is now doing his kingly duties, which he finds extremely boring, right? After you have fought off Cyclopses, after you have not been turned into a pig by Circe, after you have withstood the song of the sirens, after you have gotten past a Hydra, after you've done all these other things that he has done, that's all after helping the Greeks destroy Troy. He comes home and he finds that being a king in Ithaca is very, very boring, and that his son Telemachus is much more suited than that. So we have here a dramatic monologue where in the beginning it's a dramatic monologue, and we haven't talked about dramatic monologue yet. We're going to talk about it more when we get to the Brownings. But a dramatic monologue is essentially where one character is speaking and we don't hear what the other character is saying. We just hear their reactions. So Ulysses starts as a dramatic monologue and then turns into a grand speech to everybody who's going to join him on his ship and go off on another adventure. Now, Ulysses is an old man at this point, so you know that he's not going to come home from this adventure. He's not going to be able to overcome these obstacles the way he did when he was much younger. But it does speak to aging, and it does speak to when you've had a taste of adventure, how do you go back and live a boring home life? So that's kind of what Tennyson is looking at in Ulysses. So those are the two readings for this week. Much lighter reading and much lighter workload than what you had last week when we had both an exam and the late romantics. But I think that it'll be a nice break, and Tennyson is such an important Victorian author that I do believe that he is the man we need to introduce you to Victorianism with. So I hope you enjoyed this week's readings, and as always, if you have any questions or anything, feel free to email me and I'll be glad to answer them.